Previously on Murder Mindset. When we began this season, we explored the tragedy of Daryl Abbott, uncovering how the boundary between a performer and their audience can be fatally breached by an obsessive fan. Welcome back to Murder Mindset, Fatal Fixation. I'm your host, Kelsey Coffey. Fame often comes with a loss of privacy, but for rising star Rebecca Schaeffer, the cost of proximity was her life. Today, we examine how a young actress's tragic death at her own front door became a watershed moment, ultimately forcing the American legal system to recognize, define, and criminalize the act of stalking. Before we begin, a content warning. This episode discusses themes of stalking, invasion of privacy, and gun violence. Listener discretion is strongly advised. When we talk about Hollywood in the late 1980s, we usually picture big studio comedies, glossy magazine covers, and the kind of television that could turn a young actor into a household name overnight. It was a moment when the line between celebrity and ordinary life was getting thinner. Fans were learning more about the people on their screens, and the industry was still trying to figure out how to protect those rising stars from the darker side of attention. In that world, Rebecca Schaeffer was exactly the face executives wanted. Smart, funny, photogenic, and somehow both approachable and luminous at the same time. She was born on November 6, 1967 in Eugene, Oregon, and grew up far from Los Angeles in a family where fame was never the goal. By the time she reached her early 20s, she had gone from a teenager in Oregon to a working actress in California, appearing on the cover of 17 magazine and landing roles that hinted at a long career ahead. Her trajectory was pointed upward, and from the outside, it looked like she was simply at the beginning of something great. Television audiences knew Rebecca best from the CBS sitcom My Sister Sam, where she played Patty Russell, a young woman who moves in with her older sister and shakes up her life with energy and optimism. The show ran from 1986 to 1988. Giving Rebecca regular national exposure and putting her into the living rooms of millions of viewers every week. For a lot of fans, seeing her character, quirky, kind, and a little bit impulsive, created a sense of closeness that felt almost like friendship, even though that connection existed entirely through a screen. Between the series, her modeling work, and film roles in projects like Scenes from the Class Struggle in Beverly Hills, Rebecca was building a profile that made her instantly recognizable to people who followed television and movies in that era. She was still figuring out who she wanted to be as an artist, and the industry was just beginning to recognize how much potential she had. She was also, at the very same time, completely unaware that someone far away was watching her with an intensity that had nothing to do with admiration and everything to do with possession. Off-screen, Rebecca's life was more grounded than the Hollywood fantasy that surrounded her image. She had moved to Los Angeles to work, but her roots remained in Portland, where her parents were both accomplished in their own right. Her father as a psychologist and her mother as a writer and teacher. Friends and colleagues described her as thoughtful and socially aware, someone who cared about issues beyond fame. There's a picture here of a young woman who was simultaneously grateful for opportunity and weary of the hype, someone who carried a realistic sense of her place in the industry. But while Rebecca's story was unfolding in a relatively open, hopeful way, another story was developing in the background, one she didn't know about and never consented to be a part of. In Tucson, Arizona, a young man named Robert John Bardo was watching her career with a very different kind of intensity. He was taping episodes of My Sister Sam, writing letters, and building a fantasy in which his fixation on Rebecca was something more than mere fandom. At a time when talking about stalking wasn't yet a common part of our public vocabulary, his behavior could still be misread as the devotion of an overeager fan, instead of what it really was, an escalating threat. That misunderstanding, shared by both people around him and the systems that should have raised alarms, would prove fatal. To understand what was lost on July 18th, 1989, we have to spend time with Rebecca Schaeffer, not as a headline, but as a three-dimensional person whose life was built out of family, work in ordinary moments. Born in Eugene and raised largely in Portland, she grew up in a household where intellectual curiosity and creativity were part of the daily fabric. Her father's work as a psychologist and her mother's background in writing and theater surrounded her with conversations about human behavior, storytelling, and empathy, elements that later show up in the way colleagues describe her approach to her craft. Rebecca was an only child, and that closeness with her parents meant that they remained deeply involved in her life, even as she moved across the country to pursue acting. In high school, Rebecca began modeling, which introduced her to the idea that her appearance could be part of her work without fully defining it. She traveled, she lived for a time in New York, and she booked jobs that allowed her to appear on magazine covers, most famously 17, where her face reached a national audience even before My Sister Sam. Modeling can be a highly image-focused industry, but people who worked with her often mentioned that she seemed more interested in what might come next, the chance to act, to take on characters, to tell stories, than in becoming a static image. That shift from modeling to acting was gradual, but once it began, it reshaped her career quickly. Rebecca's move into television came when she auditioned for and landed the role of Patty Russell in My Sister Sam. Patty is spirited, optimistic, and slightly chaotic, crashing into her older sister's structured life and forcing them both to adapt. The chemistry between Rebecca and her co-star helped make the series feel warm and believable, and viewers responded to the idea of this younger character who brought a breath of fresh air into the apartment. For Rebecca, the role was demanding but rewarding. It gave her a chance to work steadily, to learn the rhythms of a multi-camera sitcom, and to build lasting relationships on set. It also gave her, almost accidentally, a large and emotionally invested fan base, something she would later discover could be both a gift and a risk. Away from the cameras, Rebecca was not living the stereotype of the detached starlet. She was known for keeping a relatively simple apartment in West Hollywood, for walking around her neighborhood, and for taking meetings and auditions with the seriousness of someone who understood that every opportunity counted. She volunteered with Thursday's Child, a charity focused on at-risk youth, visiting shelters and signing autographs. When she worried that no one at the shelter would know her or care that she showed up, she was proven wrong. Those girls recognized her from television and treated her with the kind of affectionate excitement that made the visit memorable. Professionally, she was in a transitional space, no longer a total newcomer, but not yet the established name she might have become. Her film work included Woody Allen's Radio Days and the ensemble comedy Scenes from the Class Struggle in Beverly Hills, the latter of which contained a love scene that was, for her, simply part of the role, but would later be twisted into a source of rage and a feeling of betrayal for her killer. She was considered for the lead in Pretty Woman, which means the people making casting decisions saw in her the ability to carry a major feature film. On the morning of her death, she reportedly was waiting for a script delivery and preparing for an audition with director Francis Ford Coppola, a sign of real momentum in her career. It's important to hold on to this image of Rebecca as we move deeper into the story. She was young, only 21 when she was killed, and like many young adults, she was still navigating the balance between work, personal life, and identity. She had parents who loved her, colleagues who respected her, and a public that was just beginning to know her beyond a single role. Her murder didn't just end a promising career. It tore through a family, a community, and an industry that had not yet reckoned with the full dangers of obsession. When we talk about laws, policies, and reforms later in the episode, they all trace back to the fact that a very real person, someone with hopes, fears, and relationships, was taken in a way that should have been preventable. While Rebecca was moving forward with auditions and charity work, Robert John Bardo was building a private story in which she occupied the center of his emotional world. Bardo was a Tucson native, a high school dropout who struggled with his mental health and a deep sense of disconnection from his own life. He began watching My Sister Sam shortly after it aired, taping episodes and rewatching scenes featuring Rebecca's character over and over again. For him, Patty Russell was not just a fictional young woman. She was a surface onto which he projected traits and feelings that fit his own needs. That kind of intense, focused viewing might not seem alarming on its own, but coupled with his underlying struggles, it laid the groundwork for something far more dangerous. Bardo's fixation quickly moved beyond passively watching television. He began writing letters to Rebecca, sending them to the studio, expressing admiration and a kind of longing that looked, at first glance, like the enthusiasm of a devoted fan. Her family saw some of those letters. Her father, a psychologist accustomed to unusual communications, reportedly viewed them as the ramblings of a troubled but harmless admirer. In the absence of clear threat language or explicit danger signals, that assessment made sense in the late 1980s, when our cultural understanding of what stalking actually was and how dangerous it could become was still very limited. But inside Bardo's mind, those letters were more than expressions of fandom. They were attempts to establish a real relationship with someone he had never actually met. Over time, his fixation broadened to include other young women in the public eye. Reports indicate that he developed intense infatuations with pop singers Debbie Gibson and Tiffany, and that he tried to locate them or think through ways of approaching them. He also studied past cases of celebrity stalking and violence, including the 1980 murder of John Lennon by Mark David Chapman. He even visited the Dakota apartment building in New York where Lennon had been shot, treating prior acts of violence like a kind of disturbing field research. In a letter to his sister, he wrote that he had an obsession with the unobtainable, a phrase that captures both his self-awareness and the depth of his delusion. Rebecca became his primary focus, largely because she was someone he believed he could actually find. My sister Sam gave him a clear entry point, a studio, a set, a place claiming he was there to see her. Security turned him away, doing the right thing in the moment. But the encounter did not stop him. In fact, it seems to have sharpened his sense of grievance. In his mind, being denied access was not a reasonable boundary being enforced. It was a rejection, and he believed he was entitled to more. As his obsession deepened, Bardo's thinking about Rebecca became increasingly possessive and distorted. A mental health expert who later analyzed his behavior described his thoughts about her love scene in Scenes from the Class Struggle in Beverly Hills in chilling terms. Bardo felt she was supposed to stay innocent for him, and that by appearing in a sexual scene, she had violated an unspoken agreement he believed existed between them. That internal narrative, "she's mine, how dare she," is something that experts now recognize in some of the most dangerous stalking cases. What had begun as admiration had by this point transformed into something rooted in entitlement, rage, and a desire for punishment. By the late 1980s, Bardo's fixation on Rebecca had reached a level where simply watching and writing was no longer enough. He wanted proximity, contact, and ultimately control. His earlier attempt to reach her at the Warner Brothers lot had failed, but that failure didn't lead him toward treatment or reflection. It led him toward planning. He continued to track her career, and his anger over the love scene in Scenes from the Class Struggle in Beverly Hills only grew, amplifying his sense that she had betrayed him. In his mind, she was supposed to remain static, frozen in the image he'd first fallen for, and any deviation from that became grounds for punishment. That distorted logic is central to understanding the danger he posed. Instead of seeing her as a separate person with her own career and choices, he viewed her as an emotional possession. At the same time, Bardo was actively studying how to close the gap between them. He paid close attention to previous cases of celebrity stalking, which demonstrated to him that a determined person could track down an actress at home by using information that was legally available to the public. He understood that information was power, and he began to look for ways to get it. What's important here is that his escalation wasn't purely impulsive. It involved deliberate research, careful planning, and step-by-step efforts to overcome obstacles. That level of organization would later become central to the argument that this was not an uncontrollable outburst, but a premeditated act. One of the most chilling aspects of this case is how easily he obtained Rebecca's home address. In 1989, California's Department of Motor Vehicles, the government office that handles driver's licenses and vehicle registration, kept records that included home addresses. And those records could be accessed relatively easy, especially through private investigators who knew how to navigate the system. Bardo paid a private investigator around $250 to retrieve Rebecca's address from those government files. That investigator, reportedly unaware of Bardo's intentions, provided the information, believing it was a routine job. It's a stark example of how an everyday government record can become a weapon in the hands of someone intent on harm. Simultaneously, Bardo was acquiring a gun. Because of his documented history of mental illness, he was not permitted to purchase a handgun himself, so he convinced his brother to buy a .357 Magnum revolver, powerful handgun, on his behalf, getting around the restrictions that were meant to keep firearms away from people with certain psychiatric histories. That decision, made by someone in his immediate circle, removed a crucial safeguard and gave him the means to carry out the violent fantasy he'd been building for years. And once he had both the address and the weapon, the distance between obsession and action narrowed to almost nothing. Doctors and mental health professionals who later evaluated Bardo noted that his thinking was marked by an inflated, unrealistic sense of his own importance. He described his trip to Los Angeles as though he were embarking on some kind of sacred mission. He also carried with him items he believed held symbolic meaning: a photo of Rebecca, a fan letter she had once sent back to him, and a copy of The Catcher in the Rye, the same novel that Mark David Chapman had on him when he murdered John Lennon. These weren't just random objects. They were a part of a mental script he'd written for himself, one in which he would confront Rebecca and force some kind of emotional reckoning. By July 1989, the escalation had reached its final stage. Bardo traveled from Tucson to Los Angeles, stayed in a low-cost hotel, and made his way to Rebecca's apartment building on North Swenser Avenue in West Hollywood. He had the address, the gun, and a mind shaped by years of fantasy, grievance, and the deliberate study of prior acts of violence. From an investigative standpoint, every step he took, tracking down her information, getting a gun through his brother, traveling to California, positioning himself at her door, would later add weight to the case that this was not a sudden act of madness, but a planned and deliberate pursuit. The morning of July 18th, 1989 was supposed to be a professional turning point for Rebecca. She was at home in her West Hollywood apartment, reportedly expecting the delivery of a script as part of her preparation for an audition with Francis Ford Coppola. The sound of her buzzer would have been entirely normal in that context, a sign that the material she was waiting for had arrived. But on that morning, the person standing on the other side of the door wasn't a courier or a colleague. It was Robert John Bardo, carrying a fan letter, her photo, and his own violent intentions. Bardo's first visit to her door that day did not end in violence. According to later accounts, Rebecca answered the door, greeted him politely, and realizing this was a fan who had somehow tracked her down, tried to handle the situation with grace. She reportedly told him something like, "Please take care," a gentle attempt to close the interaction without escalating it. Witnesses and later descriptions suggest that she remained composed, even if surprised, and tried to de-escalate by ending the conversation and going back inside. In her mind, this may have been a bizarre but contained moment, unsettling, but not the opening act of something deadly. For Bardo, that first interaction was a shattering disappointment. He had traveled across state lines, holding on to the fantasy that he would be seen, recognized, and given special access. That this confrontation would finally produce the emotional connection he'd been building in his imagination for years. Instead, he got a polite, brief interaction with a woman who treated him like any stranger who had shown up at her door uninvited. He later claimed that he felt rejected because she didn't spend more time talking to him. That reaction reveals exactly how entitled and fragile his fantasy had become. In a healthy mind, a brief, kind response would be appreciated and allowed to end. In his, it became humiliation. What happened next shows the shift from obsessive thinking to deadly action. Bardo left the apartment building, but he didn't leave the area. Instead, he waited and returned to her doorstep roughly an hour later, this time with the .357 Magnum revolver in his possession. That return visit is critical. It tells us he had time to think, to turn back, to choose differently, and he chose not to. He came back armed and with a plan. That gap in time between his first visit and his second would later become one of the most important pieces in the legal argument that this killing was not a heat-of-the-moment reaction, but a deliberate planned act. Inside the apartment, Rebecca had no way of knowing how dramatically the situation had changed. She was likely focused on her work, maybe reviewing notes for the audition or waiting for the script, when she heard her buzzer sound again. For someone in her position, it would be entirely reasonable to assume that the second buzzer was connected to her work. She opened the door once more, stepping into the entrance of her building, doing something countless people do every single day without fear, answering a knock at their own door. The danger was already in motion on the other side of that door, and she had no way of knowing it. From an investigative standpoint, this sequence, first contact, polite exchange, a period of separation, then an armed return, would later be reconstructed through witness accounts, physical evidence, and Bardo's own statements. Neighbors had observed the interactions, noted his movements and timing, and provided details that allowed detectives to establish a precise timeline. That timeline became crucial for prosecutors who needed to show that the killing was not a chaotic accident, but the culmination of a calculated act, carried out by someone who had decided over hours and years to confront and punish a woman who had never harmed him. The breaking point existed not in a single moment of anger, but in the cumulative weight of an unchecked obsession. When Rebecca answered her door for the second time that morning, she encountered a very different version of the man she had briefly greeted earlier. Bardo stood there, with the .357 Magnum revolver, a powerful handgun that at close range could cause a fatal wound with a single shot. According to his own later statements to doctors and police, he confronted her with anger, feeling that she had dismissed and mistreated him. In those final seconds, Rebecca reportedly tried to ask why he had come back, but she had almost no time to process the danger she was in. Bardo raised the gun and fired once. The bullet struck Rebecca in the chest, penetrating her heart, an injury that is almost always fatal. Witnesses later recalled hearing a scream, and Bardo himself described that she cried out, "Why? Why?" as she collapsed in the doorway of her building. In the space of a few seconds, the entire arc of her future was cut off. Career, relationships, the quiet possibility of an ordinary life. She fell backward as her killer turned away and fled. The scene that followed was chaotic and heartbreaking. Neighbors who had heard the gunshot and Rebecca's scream rushed to the doorway, finding the 21-year-old actress on the ground, gravely wounded. Someone called emergency services and paramedics responded quickly to North Swenser Avenue. Others tried in vain to help her as they waited. She was transported to Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, one of Los Angeles' major hospitals, but her wound was too severe. Rebecca was pronounced dead shortly after arriving, her death recorded as a homicide. For the people who had been there, the violence was both sudden and incomprehensible, a brutal intrusion into a quiet morning. Bardo fled the area, beginning what he may have imagined would be some triumphant next chapter in his story. Instead of trying to hide his identity or disappear, he traveled back to Tucson and then was spotted running along a freeway in Arizona, reportedly shouting, "I killed Rebecca Schaeffer." That declaration was both a confession and a kind of performance, as if committing the act wasn't enough. He needed an audience for it too. In that moment, he wasn't just escaping. He was announcing himself, which tells us something important about his state of mind and desire for recognition. From a legal standpoint, the crime itself was simple in structure. One shot fired at close range at an unarmed woman answering her own door. The simplicity of the act obscures the complexity of what led up to it. Years of stalking behavior, the deliberate gathering of personal information, the acquisition of a firearm through a workaround, and a planned trip across state lines to her home. The investigation that followed would have to capture both layers, the immediate, visible violence and the hidden, prolonged buildup, to present the full picture to the court. In the hours after the shooting, as Rebecca's family was still being notified, detectives were already beginning the process of understanding how she ended up dead. How she ended up dead on her own doorstep. News of Rebecca's death traveled quickly, first through emergency channels and neighbors, then through the entertainment industry, and finally into the national media. On the ground in West Hollywood, LAPD officers responded to the scene, securing the building, interviewing witnesses, and coordinating with paramedics as they transported Rebecca to Cedars-Sinai. In Portland, her mother, Dana Schaeffer, was working on a play when phone calls began to come in from Los Angeles. When she returned a call from a network executive, she reportedly heard the words that would permanently divide her life into before and after. "Miss Schaeffer, I have terrible news. This morning, Rebecca was shot and killed." That phrase, etched into her memory, marks the moment when a private family tragedy became real. Within hours, the entertainment press was reporting that Rebecca had been shot outside her apartment by an unknown attacker. Early stories focused on her status as a rising star, her role on My Sister Sam, her film work, and her consideration for high-profile movie roles. At that point, the identity of her killer was not yet public, and the story centered on the shock that a popular actress could be targeted. For many readers and viewers, the case immediately called to mind past acts of violence against public figures, including the murder of John Lennon, even before the details of Bardo's years-long obsession were widely known. On the investigative side, detectives worked quickly to gather physical evidence and witness accounts. They documented the position of Rebecca's body, the location of blood, and the gun's spent shell casing, and the path the bullet had traveled. All details that would later be used to explain exactly what happened in those final moments. Neighbors who had heard the shot and seen a man leaving the scene provided descriptions of his appearance and direction of travel. Those early statements helped investigators establish that this was not a random attack, but a targeted killing at the victim's own front door. As information flowed in, law enforcement looked beyond Los Angeles. Bardo's return to Tucson and his erratic behavior on the freeway, running and shouting that he killed Rebecca, brought him to the attention of Arizona authorities. He was detained, and investigators there quickly connected his statements to news of the killing, realizing they had likely found the shooter. Coordination between Arizona and California law enforcement allowed officials to arrange for his transfer back to LA, ensuring that he would face charges in the state where the crime had actually taken place. The response from Hollywood and the broader public was a mix of grief, anger, and a dawning awareness that something systemic had gone deeply wrong. Colleagues and friends struggled to process the fact that a gentle, hard-working young actress had been murdered at home by a stranger who had convinced himself that his obsession entitled him to access to her life. Former Los Angeles police officials would later describe Rebecca's death as a turning point, the moment that galvanized a national push for stronger legal protections against stalking. But in the immediate aftermath, the dominant emotion was simply loss of a daughter, a friend, and a promising artist whose life had been cut short by something that should have never been allowed to reach her door. Once Bardo was in custody, the investigative focus shifted from identifying the shooter to building a case that would hold up in court. Detectives and prosecutors needed more than a confession shouted on a freeway. They had to assemble physical evidence, documents that proved his movements and planning, and expert analysis of his mental state and behavior. The foundations of that evidence trail were already in place. The gun, the letters, the government records showing how he had gotten her address, and eyewitness statements from Rebecca's neighbors. One key part of the investigation involved tracing exactly how Bardo obtained Rebecca's address. Detectives followed the paper trail back to the private investigator who pulled her home information from government records, documenting the payment and process by which her personal data was released. That trail established that Bardo had actively sought out her location rather than stumbling upon it by accident, which reinforced the argument that this was a planned attack, not an impulsive one. It also exposed a troubling gap in privacy protections. In 1989, there was nothing technically illegal about using government driver records to find a celebrity's home address, even though the consequences in this instant were catastrophic. Investigators also connected Bardo to the firearm used in the killing. Records showed that he had arranged for his brother to purchase the .357 Magnum on his behalf, a workaround that allowed him to bypass restrictions tied to his mental health history. Ballistic testing, which is the scientific process of matching a bullet to a specific gun, the same one used to shoot Rebecca, combined with his own statements, that physical link between Bardo, the weapon, and the crime scene, made it very difficult for the defense to challenge the basic facts of what had happened. Another critical part of the investigation was having Bardo evaluated by a mental health professional. Dr. Park Dietz, a well-known forensic psychiatrist, a doctor who works within the legal system to evaluate criminal behavior, interviewed Bardo extensively, gathering insight into how he had been thinking before, during, and after the killing. In those sessions, Bardo described his trip to Los Angeles, his confrontation with Rebecca, and the shooting itself, often with a disturbing enthusiasm and sense of self-importance. He reenacted parts of the encounter, mimicking dialogue, and talked openly about his obsession. Dr. Dietz concluded that Bardo had schizophrenia, but he also made clear that Bardo's actions on July 18th reflected deliberate planning, rather than uncontrollable impulses or a break from reality. Detectives also reviewed his writings, letters, notes, and other documents that revealed his long-standing fixation on Rebecca and his anger over her perceived betrayal. In one letter to his sister, he explicitly described having an obsession with the unobtainable, a phrase that fit his pattern of targeting women he could see, but never actually know. His fascination with previous celebrity attacks, his visit to the Dakota building, were all documented and woven into the timeline of escalation that prosecutors would later present in court. Taken together, the evidence showed not just what happened, but how and why Bardo had moved from distant, obsessive fan to active killer. From an investigative standpoint, the case against Bardo was unusually strong. There was a clear timeline, a public confession, physical evidence, and a documented pattern of dangerous behavior leading up to the crime. The challenge for prosecutors wasn't proving that he fired the shot. That was never really in question. The challenge was proving that he had done so with deliberate intent and advanced planning in a way that qualified him for the most severe penalty available under California law. That meant framing the killing not as a sudden breakdown, but as the deadly outcome of a sustained, conscious, and dangerous obsession. To make sense of this case, we have to look closely at the psychology of stalking and the specific dynamics at play in Bardo's obsession with Rebecca. Stalking is generally understood as a pattern of repeated, unwanted contact or surveillance that causes real fear and distress in the person being targeted. It can be driven by many different motivations, from a desperate desire for closeness to cold-blooded anger and a need for revenge. In Bardo's case, we see elements of what mental health professionals call an erotomanic delusion, a false but unshakable belief that someone of higher status is secretly in love with you, combined with intense resentment and rage when reality refuses to cooperate with that fantasy. Bardo's behavior followed a pattern that experts now recognize in the most severe stalking cases. He began with distant admiration, watching Rebecca on television and focusing on her character as though the traits of a fictional person were a window into her real soul. He then moved into direct outreach, writing letters and hoping for a response that would confirm the bond he'd already decided existed. When those efforts didn't produce the intimacy he wanted, he escalated to physical pursuit, showing up at the studios and eventually at her home. Throughout this entire process, he reframed every boundary he encountered as rejection and betrayal, security turning him away, Rebecca's polite but brief interaction, even the love scene in her film, were all evidence in his mind that she had wronged him. His reaction to that love scene deserves particular attention. For most viewers, a love scene is simply part of a fictional story. It does not say anything about the actor's real-life relationships or moral character. For Bardo, it was something he experienced as a personal violation, A behavioral expert who later studied this case described his thinking as, "She's mine. She's supposed to stay innocent for me," capturing the way that entitlement and possessiveness can twist admiration into rage. In that framework, violence becomes, in the stalker's own mind, a way to punish the target and permanently possess them, erasing their autonomy and freezing them forever in the image the stalker preferred. Mental illness is genuinely a part of this story, but not in a way that removes responsibility. Dr. Dietz confirmed that Bardo had schizophrenia and harbored an inflated belief in his own importance. He saw himself as destined for fame as a writer, musician, or movie star, even though his real-life circumstances were far removed from that self-image. He dropped out of high school and had gone through psychiatric treatment, and people in his life described him as someone who had struggled for years without adequate support. And yet, despite all of that, Dr. Dietz and lead prosecutor Marcia Clark both emphasized that at the time of the murder, Bardo was not in the grip of uncontrollable hallucinations or voices commanding him to act. He planned his trip. He studied past cases. He secured a gun through his brother, used a government system to find her address. These are organized, deliberate decisions, not the actions of someone who has completely lost touch with reality. His behavior also reveals a powerful desire for recognition. Traveling to Los Angeles with symbolic objects, including a copy of The Catcher in the Rye, suggests that Bardo saw himself as part of a violent tradition. He was modeling himself on previous attackers, inserting himself into a dark historical narrative, and then shouting his confession on a freeway in Tucson confirmed it. He wasn't just trying to escape. He was announcing himself to the world. Marcia Clark would later argue that he killed Rebecca in part for fame, a theory supported by the way he positioned himself as the star of his own story, even in the telling of it afterward. Understanding these psychological dynamics matters not only for this one case, but for how we recognize and respond to dangerous fixation in general. Stalkers like Bardo tend to follow recognizable patterns: intense fixation on a target, growing feelings of entitlement, hostility at any perceived rejection, deliberate acquisition of tools and information, and a gradual move toward confrontation. When those patterns go unnoticed, or worse, when everyday systems like government records inadvertently help the stalker locate the target, rises dramatically. Rebecca's murder exposed exactly how incomplete our collective understanding of stalking was in 1989, and how urgently it needed to evolve. With Bardo in custody, the legal process began. He was arrested in Arizona after his freeway confession and quickly connected to the murder in West Hollywood. Arizona authorities detained him, and as the evidence mounted that he was the man who shot Rebecca, arrangements were made to transfer him to Los Angeles to face charges, a legal process known as extradition, which simply means moving a suspect from one state to another to be tried where the crime actually happened. The interstate coordination moved efficiently, largely because of his own very public statements. In Los Angeles, prosecutors charged Bardo with first-degree murder, the most serious level of homicide under California law, reserved for killings that were planned in advance, rather than committed in a sudden moment of passion. They also added a special legal finding called lying in wait. In California, this refers to a situation in which a killer positions himself to carry out an attack after a period and planning of deliberate watching and waiting, often concealing their true intentions until the moment of violence. Is treated as an aggravating factor, meaning it makes the crime even more serious, and when proven, triggers an automatic sentence of life in prison without the possibility of ever being released. Marcia Clark, then Deputy District Attorney and later nationally known for her role in the O.J. Simpson case, led the prosecution. From the outset, Clark made clear that the state would not seek the death penalty. However, the maximum sentence she was pursuing, life in prison without the possibility of parole, was still the harshest possible outcome short of execution. In exchange, Bardo agreed to waive his right to a jury trial, meaning the case would be decided by a single judge, the Honorable Dino Falgoni, rather than 12 members of the public. This arrangement shaped the entire tone of the proceedings, placing the emphasis on legal argument and expert testimony rather than dramatic courtroom moments designed to appeal to jurors' emotions. The defense strategy centered on mental illness. Bardo's attorneys acknowledged that he had shot Rebecca and argued that his severe psychiatric history meant that he could not be held responsible in the full legal sense that the prosecution was claiming. They presented evidence of his diagnosis, his hospitalizations, and the ways in which the mental health system had failed to adequately address his deteriorating condition over the years. At various points, the defense pursued what is known as the insanity defense, the argument that a person did not understand what they were doing was wrong at the time they committed the act. The prosecution pushed back firmly. Clark argued that mental illness and deliberate intent are not mutually exclusive, that a person can be genuinely ill and still capable of planning, making decisions, and understanding the consequences of their actions. She pointed to every deliberate step Bardo had taken: the trips to Los Angeles, the arrangement to obtain a gun through his brother, private investigator he paid to pull Rebecca's address, and his calculated return to her door after the first visit. In her view, his illness drove his obsession. It did not strip him of his ability to act purposefully within it. In the pretrial period, no one seriously disputed that Bardo would be convicted of something. The evidence was overwhelming. The real fight was about degree. First-degree murder with the lying in wait finding, which would mean life without any possibility of release, versus a lesser charge that might someday allow him to seek freedom. That distinction came down to how the court interpreted his level of planning and his state of mind at the moment of the killing. As the case moved toward trial, both sides prepared to argue not just about what happened, but about what it meant in the language of the law. The trial of Robert John Bardo was conducted before Judge Dino Falgoni in Los Angeles Superior Court, without a jury, meaning the judge alone would evaluate the evidence, apply the law, and render both a verdict and a sentence. In the courtroom, Bardo often appeared rocking back and forth in his chair, dressed in a white shirt with rolled-up sleeves, presenting an image that alternated between withdrawn and oddly theatrical. His demeanor became part of the visual record of the proceedings, observed and noted by journalists who covered the case. The prosecution laid out its narrative first. Marcia Clark called witnesses who could speak to Rebecca's life, to the events of July 18th, and to the aftermath of the shooting. Neighbors described hearing the gunshot and Rebecca's scream, seeing a man leave the scene, and the chaotic moments as emergency responders arrived. Law enforcement officers testified about collecting physical evidence, tracing the weapon back to its purchase, and coordinating with Arizona authorities to bring Bardo into custody. The private investigator who had retrieved Rebecca's address from government records explained how that transaction had worked, demonstrating plainly how easily such information was accessible to someone willing to pay a small fee. Expert testimony played a central role in shaping the trial. Dr. Park Dietz took the stand to describe his evaluation of Bardo, his diagnosis of schizophrenia, and his professional opinion that, despite that illness, Bardo's actions were calculated rather than impulsive. He described the details that Bardo had shared during their sessions, his retelling of the murder, his reenactment of the confrontation, and his tone when mimicking Rebecca's final words. Dietz acknowledged the reality of Bardo's psychiatric condition, but made clear that it had not, in his judgment, taken away Bardo's ability to plan, decide, and understand the consequences of what he was doing. The defense presented its case with a focus on mental illness and family background. Bardo's brother and sister testified about his struggles, his high school dropout, his years of psychiatric treatment, and what they saw as a system that never adequately addressed his deteriorating mental health. They painted a picture of a young man who had slowly slid deeper into illness without meaningful intervention, and argued that those circumstances, second-degree murder, which might someday allow for the possibility of release, would be more just an outcome than life without parole. Clark maintained her position throughout. She kept the jury's, or in this case, the judge's, attention on the concrete, deliberate steps Bardo had taken. In her view, he had killed for a combination of rage, entitlement, and a desire for fame, and his mental illness coexisted with those motivations rather than replacing them. She was asking the court to see him as responsible, not as a helpless victim of his own condition. After hearing all of the evidence and legal arguments, Judge Falgone retired to consider his decision. On October 29, 1991, he returned with his verdict. Robert John Bardo was guilty of first-degree murder, and the court found the lying-in-wait circumstance to be proven. In reaching that conclusion, Falgone rejected the defense's attempt to reduce the charge, determining that the state had demonstrated beyond doubt that Bardo had planned and carried out a lethal attack, waiting for his moment, concealing his true purpose, and striking when his victim least expected danger. That finding, under California law, left only one sentencing option on the table. After hearing all the evidence and legal arguments, Judge Falgone retired to consider his decision. On October 29, 1991, he returned with his verdict. Robert John Bardo was guilty of first-degree murder, and the court found the lying-in-wait circumstance to be proven. In reaching that conclusion, Falgone rejected the defense's attempt to reduce the charge, determining that the state had demonstrated beyond doubt that Bardo had planned and carried out a lethal attack, waiting for his moment, concealing his true purpose, striking when his victim least expected danger. That finding, under California law, left only one sentencing option on the table. Following the guilty verdict, the case moved into its final phase, though the outcome was essentially sealed on December 20th, 1991, Judge Dino Falgone formally sentenced John Bardo to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He did so despite the plea from Bardo's defense attorney, who argued that the sentence was disproportionate given his client's mental illness and that a lesser penalty would be more appropriate. Under California law, however, the combination of first-degree murder and the lying-in-wait finding left the court with no discretion. The maximum sentence was mandatory. In delivering the sentence, Falgone affirmed the gravity of the crime and the irreversible harm it caused. His ruling ensured that Bardo would spend every remaining year of his life behind bars with no opportunity to seek release. Not in 5 years, not in 20, not ever. This outcome reflected both the strength of the case and the growing climate of concern about stalking and targeted violence at the time. While Clark had chosen not to pursue the death penalty, the life without parole sentence sent an unambiguous message about how the court viewed the deliberate hunting down and killing of an innocent young woman at her own front door. For Rebecca's family, the sentencing brought a measure of legal closure, but no real relief. Her parents had to navigate the complex emotional reality of watching the man who killed their daughter be formally condemned to life in prison, knowing that accountability in any legal form could never undo what had been lost. In interviews over the years, they've spoken about the enduring nature of their grief and the way the case has continued to shape their lives long after the courtroom closed. The verdict marked the state's acknowledgement that a profound wrong had been done, but it did not restore their daughter, her career, or the future she had been building. In the years that followed, Bardo remained incarcerated in California. Reports indicate that he has been held at facilities including Mule Creek State Prison, and that in 2007 he was stabbed 11 times by another inmate using an improvised weapon, an attack he survived. His continued presence in the prison system serves as a daily reminder of the long-lasting consequences of his choices, both for himself and for the people who continue to live with the memory of what he did. He has never been eligible for parole, and under the terms of his sentence, never will be. The legal resolution of this case also set the stage for broader changes that would reach far beyond the courtroom. Rebecca's murder and the clarity of Bardo's guilt created a powerful and undeniable narrative. An innocent young actress had been tracked down and killed by an obsessed stranger who exploited gaps in privacy law and a legal landscape that had no real tools to stop him before it was too late. That narrative became a catalyst for policy reforms that aimed to shift the focus from punishing stalkers after the fact to identifying and stopping them early. In that sense, the sentence was not only an endpoint for this case, it was the beginning of a larger reckoning. The aftermath of Rebecca Schaeffer's murder extended far beyond the courtroom. In the months and years that followed, her death became a defining reference point in conversations about celebrity, privacy, and the dangers of unchecked obsession. Hollywood, law enforcement, and legislators all found themselves confronting the same uncomfortable question. How had a young actress ended up dead at home after a stalker used government records and hired an investigator to find her front door? One of the most significant responses came from California's state government. In 1990, roughly a year after Rebecca's death, California passed the first anti-stalking law in the United States. The new law made it a crime, punishable by state prison, to engage in repeated behavior that caused another person or their family to reasonably fear for their safety. This was a major legal shift. Before such laws existed, repeated unwanted pursuit and surveillance could be difficult to prosecute unless and until it resulted in a physical attack. With the new law, police and prosecutors had a concrete tool to intervene earlier, potentially before an obsession had a chance to cross the line into violence. Rebecca's case also prompted changes within the Los Angeles Police Department itself. In the wake of her murder, the LAPD created the nation's first dedicated stalking unit, a specialized team focused specifically on assessing, investigating, and managing credible threats against public figures and others at risk. This unit brought a new level of expertise to threat assessment, developing protocols for evaluating patterns of behavior and coordinating protective measures before danger escalated, an institutional acknowledgement that stalking requires its own set of skills, distinct from traditional police work, and that the cost of treating it as anything less can be measured in lives. Privacy policies shifted as well. The ease with which Bardo obtained Rebecca's address from government records through a private investigator highlighted a glaring vulnerability in how personal information was handled. In the years after her death, states tightened restrictions on who could access motor vehicle records and under what circumstances, limiting the ability of individuals to exploit those systems to locate and target victims. These protections were designed not only for celebrities, but for ordinary people as well, since the same pathways that led Bardo to Rebecca can be used against anyone whose address sat in a government database. For the entertainment industry, this case was a sobering education. Studios and networks began to take fan threats more seriously, investing in security infrastructure and developing guidelines for handling fan mail, on-set visits, and public interactions. Actors were encouraged to be more careful about what personal information they shared publicly and to report concerning contacts early, even when those contacts seemed, on the surface, like little more than enthusiasm. Rebecca's peers, some of whom had their own uncomfortable experiences with devoted or boundary-crossing fans, saw in her story a reflection of vulnerabilities they had not previously put into words. On a deeply personal level, Rebecca's family carried the weight of grief while watching their daughter's name become a symbol for something much larger than her individual life. Her mother, Dana Schaeffer, has spoken in interviews about the complicated emotions of seeing Rebecca remembered primarily in the context of legal reform and industry change. There is a pride in knowing that something meaningful arose from unspeakable loss, and there is pain, constant, quiet, permanent, in knowing that every positive change came at the cost of her daughter's life. The laws evolved, the industry adapted, the family. When we look back at the murder of Rebecca Schaeffer, we see not only a single horrific act, but a constellation of warning signs that, in hindsight, reveal a clear and recognizable pattern. Bardo's behavior followed a trajectory that experts now identify in many severe stalking cases, and understanding that trajectory can help us recognize and respond more effectively when we see similar patterns emerging today. One of the most important lessons is that unwanted contact should be taken seriously, even when it initially appears harmless. Bardo's letters to Rebecca his appearance at the studio with flowers and a teddy bear, and his persistent fascination and his persistent fixation could all be mistaken for the enthusiasm of an overeager fan. And at the time, they largely were. But they were, in reality, early expressions of obsessive mindset that had no interest in or understanding of boundaries. Today, professionals who specialize in threat assessment look specifically for patterns in behavior. How often someone makes contact, how intensely, and especially how the tone shifts, moving from admiration to anger, from longing to a sense of ownership. In Rebecca's case, those shifts were present and building. The systems around her were simply not yet equipped to see them for what they were. Another lesson involves the way personal information can be weaponized. The fact that Bardo could purchase Rebecca's home address through a private investigator using government records for less than a cost of a week's groceries shows how vulnerable individuals can be when privacy protections are weak or non-existent. Today, many states have significantly tightened restrictions on access to government records. Are often advised to use P.O. boxes, pseudonyms, or secured addresses to reduce their exposure, recognizing that information itself is a form of access, and that stalkers are often as methodical in how they gather data as they are in how they use it. The case also underscores the need to connect mental health care with public safety. Bardo's schizophrenia was real, and his struggles deserved genuine compassion and intervention long before things reached a breaking point. But his illness did not prevent him from planning or making deliberate choices. And it is crucial to hold both of those truths at the same time. The most effective modern approaches to threat management focus on early intervention, connecting individuals who are showing signs of dangerous fixation with appropriate mental health support while simultaneously taking protective action for the people they're targeting. These two goals are not in conflict. They are ideally two sides of the same strategy. At the most personal level, Rebecca's story is a reminder to treat boundaries as exactly what they are: protection. Whether in close personal relationships or in the one-sided connections that fans sometimes develop toward people they've only ever seen on a screen. A boundary is an expression of autonomy and self-preservation. When someone dismisses those boundaries, insisting on contact that isn't wanted, showing up where they haven't been invited, responding to distance with resentment and rage, that is a sign that the dynamic has crossed into something dangerous. For anyone experiencing that kind of unwanted pursuit, documenting the pattern, speaking to someone in a position to help, and involving law enforcement or a qualified safety professional early can make all the difference. What Rebecca's case teaches us above all else is that obsession doesn't always announce itself with obvious menace. It begins in the ordinary fan mail, flowers, a letter full of admiration. It grows slowly, quietly, beneath the surface that can easily be misread as devotion. But when the fantasy hardens into entitlement, when a real person's choices become intolerable to the imagined story someone else has written for them, that's when quiet devotion becomes something irreversible. The laws that arose from her murder, the specialized police units, the policy reforms, the privacy reforms, and the broader cultural shift toward recognizing stalking as a serious crime. All of it is part of a legacy that, though born of tragedy, continues to protect lives. Remembering Rebecca as a full person, not just as a case file, not just as a landmark in legal history, is the most important part of that legacy. There's one thing that stands out in cases like this. Obsession doesn't start out looking dangerous. It can feel like love, like dedication. But when fixation takes over, when control matters more than respect, that's when it turns deadly. For Rebecca Schaeffer, fame was supposed to be a dream, but it became a death warrant. A stranger used public records to track her down, believing that her image on screen belonged to him in real life. She opened her front door to a fan, but the man on her doorstep came with a gun and a delusion that could not be reasoned with. Investigators can piece together what went wrong, but for the victims and their families, the loss is permanent. It's a reminder to recognize the warning signs and respect boundaries for what they are: protection. Until next time, I'm Kelsey Coffey, reminding you to lock your doors bolt your windows, and never underestimate the dangers hiding in plain sight. Next week on Murder Mindset Fatal Fixation, we investigate the terror of workplace stalking through the story of Laura Black. When professional boundaries are ignored and a coworker's unwanted advances escalate into a campaign of terror, we must ask, who is responsible for keeping employees safe?